This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez with part two of our exclusive conversation with Chelsea Manning. Army whistleblower, transgender activist, spent 7 years in military prison after leaking a trove of documents about Iraq and the Afghan wars in the State Department to WikiLeaks in 2010. Now running for the U.S. Senate in Maryland. The primary is in June. I want to turn to some of the establishment today and what they had to say about you. This is in the midst of you being held in solitary confinement. I want to turn to John Bolton, who the president has named to be his next national security advisor. He was interviewed about your case in the 2012 BBC film WikiLeaks, The Secret Life of Superpower.
What do you think of Bradley Manning?
I think he committed treason. I think he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
What does that mean?
Well, treason is the only crime defined by our Constitution, and it says treason shall consist only of levying war against the United States or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And he gave our enemies a lot of aid and comfort.
So what should happen to him?
Well, he should be prosecuted, and if he's found guilty, he should be punished to the fullest extent possible.
And what is that?
Death.
You think he should be killed?
Yes.
Do you think that Manning should be killed? Yes, Bolton says. He's going to be the next national security advisor for President Trump. April 9th, he apparently takes the position.
I mean, is there a question with that?
How do you feel about that? Do you feel threatened?
No, I mean, well, yes, I feel threatened, but as any other person should feel threatened. You know, are these positions surprising? No. You know, anybody who challenges these people, anybody who challenges their power, is a threat to them. And so, yeah, they're going to go after people, and they're going to say that everybody deserves the death penalty. I mean, and it's going to be this expanding, broadening net. You know, John Bolton, as UN ambassador, bolstered, you know, the neoconservative movement in building, you know, this was during the time of, you know, the CIA and expanding into torture. Like they're trying to cover themselves up, and they're trying to protect themselves, and they're trying to. Of course, they're gonna claim that anybody who challenges them is a traitor. Everybody who goes against them is against, you know, the state, and anybody who's against them is worthy of, you know, going away.
Well, let's go to Vice President Pence just last year, describing you as a traitor on Fox News.
Private Manning is a traitor and should not have been turned into a martyr, as Senator Cotton said. Private Manning's actions compromised our national security, endangered American personnel downrange, compromised individuals in Afghanistan who are cooperating with our forces by leaking 750,000 documents to WikiLeaks.
Your response to Vice President Pence?
I mean, is this surprising? I mean, these are, again, I'm challenging these people. These people need to be challenged. And these are, they just say these words. You know, at the end of the day, they just keep saying these things about all kinds of people. You know, words like hero, words like traitor have lost their meaning. You know, everybody is a traitor in this world. You know, James Comey, Hillary Clinton, you know, Donald Trump, like everybody, it gets to the point where, you know, it's almost like it's not about, like, anybody who I disagree with becomes this label. And that's the problem with the establishment, is that anybody who's not the establishment is a threat and has violated this or violated that, you know, whether it's immigrants, whether it's people, you know, the impoverished, whether it's, you know, just so many of the most vulnerable people are getting called all kinds of different words, criminals, illegals, you know, like this is the language of power. So is it surprising that the language of power would be used against somebody who actually challenges it?
Chelsea, one of the issues that we've covered for years when you were in prison was your battle against the prison authorities around their treatment of you as a trans woman. Talk about what happened, how they treated you, and the whole issue of health care for trans prisoners around the country.
Right. So systems like prison and the military and police treat trans people, I mean, governments do this as a whole. They treat us as an administrative problem to be solved somehow. And it's at the whim of some, usually some authority or some legal position that we have our entire lives be policed. There's what uniforms you wear, what type of clothing you have access to, how much health care you get. And these are all determinations that are being made arbitrarily. Whether it's giving us health care, and telling us which types of health care are available, or what that is. So the problem is that these are systemic problems. And one of the more deeper systemic problems is the fact that trans people are disproportionately imprisoned. We're one of the most targeted groups, usually for petty offenses like sex worker related offenses and just we're policed based on gender and how we look and how we act. The walking while trans, if you will. And we need to stop. That needs to be more of a focus. Is why do we have so many trans people in our prison system? Why do we have so many people who are trans in jail? Why don't we focus on on dismantling the prison system that is in which we're placed in these situations?
Can you explain your own experience, what you were fighting for? You were held in an all-male prison, is that right, at Fort Leavenworth?
Right, and most trans people are held in one of that differs from their true gender. You
were fighting for hormone therapy. Talk about that battle and ultimately winning it.
I mean, well, I barely won it. I got access to hormones, but I mean, it was arbitrary. It was based on some signature, and only after a major lawsuit. It wasn't really a victory in the sense of, I get access to something, but I had to fight for it. I had to fight tooth and nail for it, and so many people still have to fight, to get just basic access to healthcare, especially in prison.
What about the clothes you were forced to wear in prison, and also the length of your hair, and why this mattered so much to you?
Well, because I couldn't grow my hair, so I've always wanted to grow out my hair. It's always been shortly cropped, but I was kept at a military standard. But it was also the notion of an institution telling me, hey, because it was this notion of yeah, we know you're pretending to be a woman, so we're giving you some things because we're legally required to do so, but we're going to do everything that we can in other regards to make sure that you're not treated as who you actually are. So it's this notion of value. I value who I am, and I value my identity, and as all of us should, and we should be able to defend ourselves and fight back. And that was what drove me day to day while I was in these circumstances, and the clothing and whatever. But yeah, a lot of this is stuff in the past for me. A lot of this is things where I've come from, but I'm more focused on what's facing us today,
right.
What we're facing right now.
Well, certainly that would be something that trans prisoners are faced with, and that you would hopefully make a difference in if you became Senator of the United States.
I mean, I'm hoping to get trans people out of prison. That's the objective. It's not about making conditions better. It's not about making more or better prisons. It's about closing them down and releasing people. So we should be releasing trans prisoners.
You've talked about you looking to get criminal justice reform, anti-military.
Not reform. Dismantling the criminal. We need to restructure and dismantle the criminal justice system.
Dismantling the criminal justice system and ending the military involvements around the world, and also immigration. Could you talk about some of the other issues that you would consider you'd want the voters to consider when they vote for you?
Health care. We need to have basic access to health care for everyone, and we shouldn't have our health care policed by the state either. We've seen this in situations. We've seen people go who are afraid to go to hospitals because of who they are or what their background is or what their legal status is. So we need to remove. We need to provide health care for everybody. It should be free. It should be accessible. It should be, and there should be a doctor-patient relationship that is unaffected by. The state should not be intervening into into who you are and why. You should just be getting access.
Healthcare for all.
Healthcare for all, but unconditionally. It's not. You don't have to fill out forms or get, or have the state police you based on, you should feel safe to go to a hospital or to get health care.
Your comments on the current Me Too movement in this country, what it has meant, does it give you strength that just the organizing of people?
Well, it's a large movement that has a diaspora of people that have different positions. I'm more focused on getting solidarity among people that's not necessarily based on a particular issue. I believe that the way in which we can fight back against these institutions of power is to focus on the institutions of power, not to focusing on the symptoms, if you will. We need to deal with the systemic problems that underlie why why are people that do these things being placed in these positions in the first place? Why do we have a system and a structure that placed them there, and allowed them to fester for years, and why are they continuing to be able to defend themselves, whenever there's overwhelming evidence that these things are happening? And so, the systems of accountability are not working, and certainly we can't depend on government to do that and the court system to do that.
Would you abolish the NSA? Your state, Maryland, the state you'd represent as senator, represents the largest intelligence agency in the world, far, far larger, for example, than the CIA, the National Security Agency, where you were actually court-martialed.
Right. And the National Security Agency collects an enormous amount of data and information, but it's more of these policing agencies that I'm focused on. ICE. ICE has more law enforcement power than any other federal law enforcement agency, and it's only a matter of time. And we've already seen people who are assisting, people crossing the border and assisting people that, be arrested and charged with federal offenses. They're going to expand the net of their federal law enforcement powers over the next few years. They've already said that they're going to do this. ICE didn't exist 18 years ago. It's a brand new institution. It didn't exist whenever I was a teenager. It should go away. We don't need ICE. We don't need a lot of these gigantic, police agencies that are singularly focused on, deporting people.
I want to ask you, it's been a year and 3 months now since President Trump was inaugurated. You were arrested, tortured, and then eventually had your sentence commuted under President Obama. And now we have President Trump. I'm wondering how you see how the country has changed since Trump came into office and what your candidacy would represent in terms of resistance to that.
Right. We often personalize administrations allow us to personalize these systemic problems. Oh, it's Bush, it's Obama, it's Trump. These are systemic problems that both political parties that are in power have bolstered and maintained, the whirling death machine, if you will, of power. It's always about tweaking. It's always about either being aggressive with it or having a more law and process approach. Whenever the the real problem is that none of these systemic problems ever get addressed because of the entrenchment of the establishment.
But yet you're running in the Democratic primary, right? Against Ben Cardin.
We should primary. Ben Cardin is an establishment Dem. He's an establishment Democrat. He's been doing that. He's been in Maryland politics for 40 years. All these problems have been built over even more than 40 years. So we need to start pushing back against these people. We need to start pushing back against the establishment. The establishment and the systemic problems need to be addressed.
Can you talk about your activism around anti-fascism and also how you're going to conduct your campaign? The primary is coming up soon. It's in June. What are you going to do to run throughout Maryland to get your name out there and your positions out there throughout the state? Not that your name isn't known, but as a senator from Maryland.
So I've been meeting with activists and organizers locally. I've been more on a listening tour because I want to hear what they have to say, what their positions are, what the concerns are, and before I started to publicly, roll out there. Obviously, you have to file pretty early in the Maryland primary, so. A lot of the work is going to come over the next few months, and being on this program is a part of that. So I would say that my activism and how I'm running are hand in hand. I mean, I'm running as an activist. I'm not running to have a career as a senator. I'm here as a continuation of my career as an activist who pushes against these systemic problems and these systemic structures. I'm not willing to get entrenched into the circle of lobbying and the network of revolving door politics. I mean, I've already been excluded. The language that they use excludes me by default. I'm not. I'm inexperienced, or I'm. Think about that for a second. Inexperience. Ben Cardin's been in politics, Maryland politics, for 40 years. He's been behind a desk that whole time. What experience can he bring to the table? I mean, I have life experience. I've been out there. I've been homeless. I've been to prison. I've been to war. These are what I consider experience. So we need to start pushing back. And the way we do that is by focusing on the systemic problems, like criminal justice system, immigration, and
what would you do
healthcare.
With the prisons of the United States?
We need to start closing them. We need to start closing prisoners. We need to start releasing prisoners and then closing prisons down. We should put a moratorium on construction first off, and then start closing prisons.
And in terms of immigration, what would you do?
Abolish ICE. Abolish the CBP.
And our borders?
I mean, borders are imaginary lines. They're something that we draw, through the middle of a desert. We invented the border. It wasn't there previously. People should be able to move freely about the world.
Let me ask you specifically, as an intelligence expert, when you heard about Cambridge Analytica, and now the FTC, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, is investigating Facebook. When you heard about Cambridge Analytica, gathering information on millions of Americans without their knowledge, like 50 million Americans, your thoughts?
It's unsurprising. The corporate world has become an extension of the surveillance state, but it's become this private interest surveillance state where if you have enough money, you can learn as much about these people as possible. And their mission, of course, has been to, brazenly manipulate people. Now how well they do that is, I guess, going to be the focus on the investigation, but that's their stated goal. Is it surprising that they're under investigation for doing what they claim to do?
Mm-hmm. What was your response to Pence saying you endangered people, you know, presumably referring to the redacting of names and the documents that came out in WikiLeaks?
I mean, the government's been using all of this rhetoric for 7 years, and for 3.5 years they said it, and then they had to deal with a courtroom, and they couldn't bring a shred of evidence to the courtroom. Instead, they merely said, "Oh, could have." It was all hypotheticals. So these are just talking points. They're just hot air. It's been continuing.
I wanted to read from BuzzFeed. In the 7 years since WikiLeaks published the largest leak of classified documents in history, the federal government has said they caused enormous damage to national security. But a secret 107-page report prepared by a Department of Defense task force and newly obtained by BuzzFeed News tells a starkly different story. It says the disclosures were largely insignificant and did not cause any real harm to U.S. interests. Chelsea Manning.
I mean, that's what we've been saying this whole time. You know, they agreed with us. But instead, during a trial, they said could have. It was all about maybe. You know, what crime is it where you could have? You know, if I threw this rock, I could have broken a window. You know, and of course, it wasn't going to cause any damage. And the whole notion of national security, it's a word that gets used, it's a phrase that gets used a lot in politics. But do you know what the definition of national security is? The definition of national security is that anything of and relating to the national defense, meaning the military, or foreign relations, meaning the State Department, anything can be construed as being national security. That's an incredibly broad definition. And interests is, what is it? Interests. Interests is whatever they want. So if it's whatever these institutions want, and it's against their interests, which is against our interests as people, then it's a threat to national security. So in a sense, everyone who goes against them is a threat to national security.
I'm wondering, subsequent to your revelations, there was the revelations of Edward Snowden, the enormous impact it had on the American public in terms of understanding the surveillance state. Your advice to other people who are in network securities in other parts of the world in terms of the potential of being whistleblowers and the importance of being a whistleblower, yes, when you believe that something is unjust or is wrong, that an institution that they're associated with is committing, what would be your advice to potential whistleblowers?
You know, you're in a better position to understand what the issue is and what you have to do. I can't give people specific advice. What I can say is that there's a lot of rhetoric, and a lot of people in government and a lot of people in these positions already know that there are no safe channels to go through. Like, we've had, you know, I have a friend of mine, you know, Jesslyn Raddick, who's been on the show a lot, who has defended people who have gone through the proper channels from prosecution and from being targeted. The Insider Threat Program, whenever you raise a concern, you are automatically listed under the Insider Threat Program as a potential threat and placed under surveillance, under electronic surveillance or a surveillance by your supervisors. That said, there are no safe channels. You have to make a decision as to what to do, and that's my advice.
Are you concerned you're being surveilled, monitored today?
I mean, we all are.
You any more than anyone else?
I mean, it depends on the focus or the day, but I mean, that goes for all of us.
I wanted to turn to Michael Ratner, the late Michael Ratner, one of the founders of the Center for Constitutional Rights, who appeared on Democracy Now! In 2013, shortly after attending part of your court-martial, when you accepted responsibility for leaking information, when leaking documents to WikiLeaks.
It was one of the more moving days I've ever spent in the courtroom. You've heard from Bradley Manning once before, which was when he testified about the torture that happened to him. I was crying through that. This was amazing. I mean, he actually didn't stand. He sat at the defense table. and he read his 35-page statement, which sadly we do not have a copy of, even though there's nothing classified about that statement. And hopefully we'll get it, because that is something that should be taught in every school in America. He went through each of the releases that he took responsibility for, that you mentioned on the air, and he told us why he did it. And in each case, you saw a 22-year-old, a 23-year-old, a person of incredible conscience saying, what I'm seeing the United States do is utterly wrong. It's immoral, the way they're killing people in Iraq, targeting people for death rather than working with the population. This is wrong. And in each of these statements tells you about how he was doing it politically. That
was the late Michael Ratner, one of the founding attorneys of the Center for Constitutional Rights, in 2013, coming from your trial and coming on Democracy Now! The next day. Your thoughts on what Michael said, and would you do this again if you had the chance?
Look, I can't go back and change history. I can't reflect on every single moment that I've gone through my entire life. And I reflect a lot on all kinds of decisions throughout my life, mostly to do with relationships that I've had and jobs that I've held in the past, and decisions that I've made, especially in regards to college. Should I have stayed in college? Should I have stayed at Starbucks? That said, this couldn't have happened any other way. It happened because of who I am and the values that I have and the time that I had and the means, the technology that was available. And also, it almost didn't happen. I tried to reach out through conventional journalists, if you will, and the technical complexities, they just couldn't work around.
Well, wait, for 1 second. Could you explain exactly what you did? For people who aren't familiar with your course, when you were in Iraq, you got a hold of these documents. You saw what you described as the horror documented in the government's own pages and wanting to get it out. Coming back to the United States, it wasn't WikiLeaks you went to first.
Right, of course not. I mean, they weren't a thing yet. They weren't a name. And I mean, like I ran out of time. I didn't have a whole lot of time. I had about 12 days, and 3 of those days were taken up by a snowstorm.
Before you were going back to Iraq.
Correct.
So you turned to the New York Times. You tried to reach out.
Well, I reached out to the Washington Post first.
And what did you?
But I mean, this is a lot of this information I'm saving for my book. So
the Washington Post, you called them?
I'm saving a lot of these details for the book. But yes, I did reach out to the Washington Post.
And they didn't want the documents, or they did?
I mean, it's technology. Technology is the problem. Secure drop is something that came out of all of this. It's now possible to reach out to the Washington Post and use these tools. They weren't. They had. There's a lot of detail, and I'm saving a lot of this for the book.
But they couldn't do it.
It's a mostly technical problem, technical problems and sort of an understanding. Like, journalists didn't really have an understanding as to the technical problems.
Why you couldn't just send it to them by regular email?
Exactly.
Why Washington Post did you go to?
All the President's Men.
Exposing Watergate.
That was my reference, was a movie. So. And
why the New York Times? And what did they say?
New York Times, because it's a big name. Same thing, technical problems. I mean, I'm not going to. I'm saving a lot of that for the book. And
so WikiLeaks, which wasn't very well known at the time, had released Sarah Palin's email or something.
Right, but they knew the key here. I mean, and it wasn't just there was a number of people associated with the organization then. And it was very small, but I mean, they had the technical means. They had all of the technology, and they understood it. So it was just, and I ran out of time. I ran out of time. I had to go back, and
but ultimately they would. The New York Times, is that right? And the Washington Post would publish some of the documents that you had procured in Iraq.
Right. I mean, is this surprising?
If you were Senator of the United States, and even as not a Senator of the United States, as an activist, what are you pushing for when it comes to the military?
We spend almost $600 billion a year on our defense budget, and there's various other portions that go into the paramilitary portions of our government. We need to spend this money somewhere else. It needs to be, you know, we have other issues. We don't need to have 800 bases all across the world. We don't need to have we already have the largest system in the world. We don't need more, and they're always asking for more. Isn't that funny? Like, it's already the largest. We're already spending $600 billion a year, and yet, you know, it's on boondoggle projects like the F-35. You know, we're going to stop that. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that defense funding bills for more stuff don't happen.
What gives you hope as we wrap up this interview?
What gives me hope is the people I have to my left and right. The people that I'm in solidarity with, especially when I'm doing activism, and especially whenever I'm in these meetings. The people who have been with me this whole time, the people who are fighting with me, and the people that I know will be by my side whatever happens.
Chelsea Manning, thanks so much
for
joining us. Chelsea Manning, Army whistleblower, transgender activist, spent 7 years in the military in a military prison after leaking documents about the Iraq and Afghan wars and the State Department to WikiLeaks in 2010. Now running for the U.S. Senate in Maryland. The primary is in June. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. To see part one of our discussion, the whole broadcast of Democracy Now! Today, you can go to democracynow.org. Thanks so much for joining us.